Hello, everyone. I am Stephen Drew from the Architecture Social. You know all of who I am, but guess what? That's what's good about this show. We get awesome guests from the industry. And I've met this guest before, actually, at the Architects Benevolent Society, and admired what they do from afar on Twitter in the scope in the architecture world. So I'm thrilled to be joined here by an awesome guest, Sumita Singha. How are you today, Sumita? Are you okay?
I'm good. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for coughing when you were trying to introduce me.
No problem at all. No problem at all. Well, I appreciate you making the time to be here. And I think that we've had a lot in common actually as well, because I know you've done a lot for international students, and we'll get onto that in a bit. But Sumita, for anyone that's not familiar with the work that you've done in architecture, can you give us a little bit about yourself?
Uh, okay. So, talking about international students, I actually didn't study in the UK. So, I studied in India and I came
Ah,
here and I on a scholarship to Cambridge and I studied environmental design. And that led me to practice sustainable design like, from 30 years ago when nobody was talking crisis. And I've been teaching about sustainability and technology for roughly about the same time. I'm designing stuff which is ethical and sustainable and writing about it.
brilliant. Well, that's really, really useful. And actually, it's quite a poignant time, especially in architecture. We're talking about sustainability as we should be. And I appreciate all you've done there. And going back to it as well, because Architecture Social, there's a lot of students who are currently looking for jobs in the UK. And we've just gone through Brexit. And now we're kind of going through a cost of living crisis as well. And I think that international students in particular, I did a podcast recently, which was well received, talking about the struggle, the uphill battle sometimes that a very qualified architect, international architect, can get in the UK. And as well as that, me and you have talked about as well the ongoing struggles that international students have with university fees, and as you say, then get the barriers getting into industry. So I think it's awesome to have someone like yourself who's kind of done the journey. Well, what would be your thoughts right now to any students, perhaps in the current in 2022? Do you have any thoughts on currently the climate, the economic climate at the moment for young architectural professionals?
Certainly, I mean, first of all, I have to say that things are very different now to 30 years ago when I came to this country.
Yeah.
Um, I had got a scholarship because we were very poor.
Mm.
There was no way I could have even gone through architecture because we lived in one room and I had to sleep on the table.
Well,
So there were three daughters. My dad, who was a school teacher in a government school, and my mom used to shop around for the cheapest food. She used to go when it got dark so she could buy all the things they were literally throwing away. And so, in those circumstances, for me to get stuck, like, drawing pens, I didn't have drawing pens until I think I was in my second
mm,
year. I was drawing everything using pencil. So,
right.
when I came to this country, everyone looked rich to me. But, and especially Cambridge, especially in Cambridge, it was, I was just surrounded by really posh people. So coming from that environment, it wasn't uh, nice. I just felt really out of place. And today, a lot of, I think, middle class overseas students come here. They probably might not be in the sort of dire circumstances that I was those years ago. But
Mm,
problem is fees have increased. So my fees, for example, were very low,
Yeah.
and I had the scholarship. My living costs were also low, but those have all gone up proportionately, really high now. So people from, overseas students are really suffering. And because I teach in the UK and in Italy, I have found that students travel from one place to the other to find the cheapest place to study and live. So I've met somebody who's done their part one in Manchester. Then she's gone to Germany and done something
Mm.
else. And now she's in Italy doing something else. So students are sort of migrating, international students, and British students are also doing the same. So I have students from Russia, from South America, from Europe, from Asia, just Africa as well, which is great. And so everyone is really struggling because of, as you mentioned, cost of living crisis, fees going up. But some of the European countries don't charge fees for architecture. So the UK does. So they
Mm.
migrate and go to countries where they will have free or cheaper um, fees. They pay less fees. Yeah.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And I guess we share humble backgrounds as well, because I wasn't quite sleeping on the kitchen table, and I think that's a journey. But like yourself, I come from humble roots in Wales, and my parents basically saved up every penny to support me while I was studying architecture, and I had to work a part-time job. And you're right, I was lucky because or at the time, I felt unlucky actually, because I was the year just when they put the fees up from 1,000 to 3,000. I was like, damn, I missed it. But compared to what students pay at the moment, which is £9,000 for domestic students, and goodness me, I'm not even sure what international students pay in now, but it's well above 10. I think it's like 10 to 20,000 or something crazy per year to study. And the other thing is as well, architecture education. Now, I loved doing my part one and part two. And even though I don't practice architecture anymore, I still love design. And I think all the skills are transferable. It's an amazing course. That's my opinion. It is 5 years, though, isn't it? As well as working in industry and then getting into the industry can be up to 7 to 8 years. And what I worry with at the moment is, as you said, if we've got international and domestic costs to study architecture, and then as you said, likely you're going to be renting an apartment, paying for food and supplies and all that. The reality is you could rack up 70,000 plus in debt at the moment, and then you exit university, you have to look for a job, and then fortunately the salaries are not quite in line with that. I mean, it's amazing because architecture, you get to design buildings, but it's a high price to pay, isn't it, for that passion of architecture, especially if you've got student debt at the moment. So I was just kind of wondering your thoughts on that. Do you feel that maybe the course is it's quite long at the moment, or do you think that we need to start having conversations about different forms of architecture education? Like the apprentice scheme seems like a really awesome way to me to learn on the go. I would love your thoughts on that and where you see it all going.
Yeah. So when I studied in India, I was in a RIBA validated school, but my apprenticeship or
Right.
route was actually not even a year, it was 6 months. So I did 4.5 years, and then of pure study. I did six
Mhm.
months of working for a practice. Actually, I worked for a conservation uh, body, and that was considered enough. And I'm thinking, how come in the UK you've got this situation where you do 3 years, you're out,
Yeah.
2 years, then you're out, and then so you're extending the course really for 9 years. And all the time your expenses are racking up because you're able
Mm.
to earn money, right? And so in Italy, where I teach, it's
Yeah.
the same
Yeah.
system. They have 5 years of education, they sit an exam, and then they are registered as architects. So, I mean, the thing here is we believe
Right.
that if you are working through your education, you're somehow learning, right? But the whole problem is that if you're being exploited and if you're
Yeah.
drawing windows for 1 year, you're not really getting the education you need, practical education
Yeah.
you need. So I think,
Mm.
I'm the board trustee, RIBA board trustee for education. I'd like to see this explored in more depth and seeing, is this working for students? I mean, ultimately, I have to kind of think, is this working for students or not? You know, if it's not working, then we have to find
Mm.
something else. Well,
Yeah.
I'm
I think.
sorry, I'm a external examiner for a university where most students come from a lower socioeconomic background. And I went to review their work, really excellent work, and the students were lovely, amazing people. But they
Mm.
struggled through the COVID because they don't have laptops. They were sort of, some of them were in a similar situation to how I was in India,
Mm.
living in one room, and they didn't have access to Wi-Fi. So they really suffered. And in one of their courses, the dropout was 50%, you know, because that required them to do stuff
Well.
on the laptops, which they didn't have. And then now they've got grants to buy laptops. But, this situation is still happening where there is digital poverty, economic poverty, and social poverty. And we need to do something for students to, you know, I mean, architecture is not a middle class profession and shouldn't be. It should be for everyone. If it's for everyone, then how can we
Mm.
enable everyone to study it?
Mm. Well said. I think that's. I'm glad that we have people who share those thoughts. I think common sense, but also I think it's really important, and that's why I admire with yourself being on the RIBA Board of Education. We need to have these conversations because there's a lot of awesome stuff that happens there. But as you said, the times are constantly moving, and we need to constantly be, I guess, evolve and agile. You touched upon one or two really interesting bits here, and I'm really keen to talk about as well as gamer myself when I came into architecture 10 years ago. I felt like some people made a lot of effort, but at the time as well, I wasn't quite sure in the office who was quite open about these situations. And I'm glad in 2022 we can talk about this stuff. But I know that as well as that, you founded Architects for Change and in particular the Equality Forum at the RABA, which I think is really really important. And I want to, do a little clap then. So I haven't got my soundboard, but I'll do a real clap because equality, inclusivity is so important. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that now at the moment, especially in 2022. So the time of recording this is probably is June, July 2022. So I mean, where do you see the industry going now, since especially you getting involved in it? Has there been a big change, and do you think we're going in the right direction? But do you also feel like there's a lot of work then, Sumita, that we need to do as an industry as well to keep pushing in that direction?
Yeah, so 26th of July will be 22 years since Architects for Change was founded. It's interesting to see. Yeah, it'll
Ooh.
be 22 years. And it'll be interesting to see if things have improved. If you look at the statistics, for example, I was chair of women in architecture in 1999, and there were 8% women. At the moment, there are 30%
Yeah.
women. So, and
Yeah.
and also last year, there was something like 50 to 60% women that entered into architectural education in 2021. So we're seeing more women going in. And consequently, I think the percentage will rise faster than it has in the last few years. So that's a good thing. When I was chair, um, one of the things I did was to have a person for LGBTQ. That time when nobody was really talking about this issue in architecture. So we had people there to represent um, that side of the things as well. We've had Black architects representation. We've had disabled people on that committee. I'm not sure what's happening now because obviously I'm not chair anymore. But that was the whole point, that people who are not represented widely
Mm.
are represented through that group, and voice their concerns and other issues through that group. So as regarding, I think the percentage of minority ethnic architects has gone up a little bit. But there you have the intersectionality. So if you're, say, if you're Black, disabled, and a woman, then it's very little chance that you actually, there might be one person like that. But why should it be like that? Architecture should be an inclusive um, profession. People, no matter what their situation is, should be able to study. I've seen schools of architecture, and I go there and says, how is the wheelchair going to
Mm.
go? Oh, we don't have any disabled students. That's the response I get. But I'm then saying, but what if you did have? What are you going to do? You don't have
Mm.
any facilities for disabled students. The course I'm teaching in Italy, it's called Women in Architecture. And the whole campus, we analyzed the whole campus, which was designed by men for men, with no intention that women would actually one day be working and studying in it. So we've analyzed little details like where the toilets are, how secure they are, etc. And we found it was astounding that women weren't even thought about in the design. And it's not it was designed in the 70s, this particular building we've studied. So now we're putting forward a manifesto and then design interventions for that campus. But, so the thing, what I'm saying is that to move from actually getting the stats and then moving on to actually doing something does take time. Most of my students are in their 20s, and they had been studying on that campus, Italian campus, for 5 years, and none of them had noticed anything wrong with it. We get used to it, right?
Mm.
And then when I started exploring and saying, well, this is right, this is not
Yeah.
right, then they said, oh, okay, this is not actually right. It's not right. Let's do something about it. But before that, they weren't even aware. So the awareness comes from actually saying to people, well, what's wrong? Let's do something about it.
Yeah, well said. I remember as well that during my part one, and I enjoyed my part one and part two, and my part two was really good because I went to Manchester, and they were really good fun up there. And but where I remember during my part one, especially first year part one, you know what it's like. You got a lot of people who I guess quote unquote don't make it, and I remember one incident, and it kind of stuck with me where you had a deaf architect, an architectural student in the making. Architecture should be open to all. And they did have some support, but it wasn't quite there, as in there would be some support that would come with this deaf student to the lectures and try to translate, but it wasn't quite enough. Like, it's very hard to hear talk about architecture seminars secondhand from someone who's not architecturally trained writing notes. And I remember that as a kind of example of good intentions, but not quite getting there. And again, in essence, that person, I think they dropped out 5 to 6 months in, probably because of the demands of the course were quite tricky. But you're right, it wasn't, you wouldn't obviously think of that, but having witnessed it, I remember thinking to me of, wow, this course is incredibly inaccessible for someone who is deaf, you know?
Absolutely. One of my employees, she was deaf.
Yeah.
And what happened was she first applied to me, and I'm a school
Right.
practice, and I thought, well, I can't really support her that well. So I encouraged her to apply to a much larger practice, which was nearby.
Mm.
And she applied to them, didn't get through. And I kept meeting her on the street, and I'd say to her, have you have you got a job? And she'd say no. Then in the end, I thought, this is ridiculous. You know, let me take her in. And fortunately, at that point, my workload increased, so she could
Yeah.
I could support her, pay her. But the thing I discovered about architecture is that it is not so much
Mm.
visual as I don't know what the word is. Is it oral or oral? You know, auditory. Yeah. So
Okay.
she
Yeah.
couldn't I mean, there were practical things like she couldn't open the
Mm.
door if there were visitors. She couldn't answer the telephone. When I took her on to site meetings, um, she she um, she lip read. So I had to position people in such a way that she could see all our mouths. And it was quite difficult to do for a small practice to have her.
Right.
But she stayed on for 5 years until actually she moved from the area. And she offered to stay on, but I didn't want her cycling through London to
Oh,
come to
wow.
me. She had gone to North London. She would have cycled to West London, where I am. And I said, no, but we've remained friends and I've supported her. But again, the same problem is there. She didn't go beyond part two. She's an extremely talented, amazing individual, but she works for a large practice now. But she works in their sort of graphics department. She doesn't work as an architect. And I've always sort of had lunch with her and said, why don't you
Right.
try? I had a word with her boss to see, if she could do her part three. It's incredibly difficult if you're disabled.
Yeah. 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 Well said. I think we're getting there, but as you say, there's a lot of work to be done, and you touched upon as well, and that's a staggering fact of people. Or when you came into architecture, it was like 8 to 12% female, which is completely mad. And I'm glad that's going in the right direction. I remember a few years ago. Remember it came out on the gender pay gap, and that kind of blew people's minds. And I guess one of the things that I see, especially in recruitment, is the people that fall behind the gaps. And obviously, gender pay gap is awful. I'm glad we're starting to talk about that. There still needs to be had a lot of conversations on that. And the pandemic is awful, but one of the blessings of the situation of the pandemic, because the actual virus, awful. What's interesting though, because another inaccessible thing I think of architecture, and it's amazing that you took someone on for 5 years, you taught them, and I admire that with a physical disability, and because we can all get past that. But what's interesting as well is parents, in particular mothers. I always found that having a child in architecture had caused this massive it could really disrupt an amazing female architect's career. And it wasn't talked about a lot. It was very hard to return to from maternity. Sometimes architectural practices were kind of questioning what was going on, when we all know, you got to take a bit of time out and have a kid. It's a special moment at normal. And as well as that, the inflexibility, Samita, on, for instance, picking up kids in the morning, then to do the work. And it was very, very difficult you have to be there 9 to 6 and working long hours culture. And the one blessing I think from the pandemic is now we're kind of getting used to working flexi remote. I think employers is having to change the way they view the relationship of managing employees and being flexible in these situations. And then on the upside, the ones who actually embrace people, give them flexibility, hire kick-ass mothers returning from work, you get the most amazing talent out there. But I would love your thoughts on that scenario of mothers returning to work. Did you find before similar to what I'm talking about? And are you seeing things going the right direction now?
Somewhat. I think this situation with women accessing childcare is
Mm,
still difficult because most architects are small practices. They can't afford to have nurseries, and architectural pay isn't that good that you can actually drop your child
mm,
to a nursery and then work. So there's that the low pay, the lack of facilities for childcare is missing. The other thing that's missing is okay, you've decided you're going to look after your child,
mm,
but you want to come back to architecture after they go to school. There is no women's returners course anymore. There used to be one.
mm.
So that's missing. And what we also need, as you've mentioned, is flexible working. I mean, with my two, when they were little, I used to take them in the buggy. They played happily on the site. I mean, there was no health and safety in those days. They would, they grown up on sites really. And, both of them are very architectural minded now as adults. But yeah, I just had to do it. And um, I don't think that situation has actually improved. Um, it, I hear of the situation in Scandinavia, which is
Right.
much better for women. And apparently, the best place for women architects to work in is Vietnam. I didn't think of that, but according to some kind of world survey,
Mm,
it's a good place for
well,
women to work. I don't know why, but maybe they have more childcare facilities. Maybe the social structure is such that they have like the joint family system where the woman can leave her child with the family and go off to work, so on and so forth. But whereas if we look at the Western world and particularly UK, I don't think we have improved that much. I'm sorry to say that.
very good. Well, this is what it's about, isn't it? Fleshing out these topics, and that is an interesting perspective and well informed. And it's kind of a bit of a shame. I think that do need to push into that area. On that note, it's quite interesting that I especially work with a lot of architecture practices in terms of hiring, and there's a skill shortage at the moment currently while we're recording this. And I heard through the grapevine of a company that's tempted to go back to telling the employees to come in 5 days a week. And I was just thinking, you can't do that right now, especially when we're starting to get used to. I think the new norm is probably 3 days in the office remote and working 3 days in the office physically, 2 days remote. Well, I think it should be the person's choice. If they want to come in 5 days, that's up to them. But enforcing people to do that and kind of going back on the inflexibility, it's like the one lesson we've learned for the pandemic, and then we're going back to it. And I just wonder, I don't know where that thing is. Yeah, there's like a nervousness in architecture before the pandemic of, if you're not in the office, what are you doing? And I remember before the pandemic of speaking to one or two architecture practices before, and the directors would be like, no chance can we work remote, not at all. And I remember I would send people, introduce people to companies who maybe wanted that flexibility or wanted to work at home, and it was a complete no-go. But now it's starting to be embraced. I mean, do you have any thoughts on good practices that you've seen from architecture companies that are inspiring at the moment, Samita? Is there anything you've seen or heard of which you think is good that we should all take
Yes, I
lessons
think
from?
there are a couple of actually small practices that have embraced the 4-day week, 3-day week, etc. Um, so you think if a
Mm,
small practice can do that, larger practice can obviously do that. But I think
yeah.
everyone needs to do it because the COVID pandemic actually had some really positive things as well. The fact that I think people's work life balance improved in some ways. They could spend time with their families, and they were still very productive. So obviously there is need for us to come on site. There's need for us to have meetings. Architecture is a very interactive profession. but let's do it. We don't have to do it all the time. Let's do it
Mm,
differently. So let's say a mum, she wants to drop her kid to school, then come into work, say she does like whatever, 5 hours or 3 hours, and then she
yep.
goes back, picks her kid from school, and then, does the rest of the day from home, which means she doesn't have to pay the childcare nursery costs, which I had to pay
Yep.
for one of my kids. Um, and everybody's happy. The kids happy, the mom's happy, the employers are happy. So I think we need to start thinking flexibly, and we haven't been thinking that. And also in terms of studying, as I mentioned, my students in this Italian course come from everywhere. And because we had a system of online teaching as well, and also all my lectures were recorded so that students can listen to them later. So there's a system attending students and non-attending students, and both attending and non-attending can listen to my lectures, which are recorded and then on a shared system. So that way nobody missed out. And so I had students, for example, from Azerbaijan or somewhere else, listening in, who could do the exercise I had asked them to do where they were based, and then come back and ask me questions online. I had students in Amsterdam at
Mm,
the same time. So it was a way of teaching and working that I thought, oh, this is great. And the students were very complimentary about it because, it worked for them, whether they were there face to face. Even I wasn't available face to face because I couldn't stay in Italy for all that time. So I was doing some of the lectures online and some of them on site. Um, but this kind of flexibility allowed me and the students to actually get the best from the lecture series that I was doing.
amazing. I think it's very interesting, and I'm glad that we're all overcoming and learning. And so, equality, inclusivity, really, really important. And what I'd love to learn a little bit about you from, if it's cool, while I have you here for a moment, is that sustainability, going towards more ecological architecture, being mindful of the environment. Now, I talk a lot about employment on this channel because that's what I tend to do. And I would love someone like yourself who's well informed. I would love to hear your thoughts on what you're passionate about at the moment, and what is maybe current pressing issues, but maybe as well you can impart a little bit of wisdom on my podcast in terms of your thoughts about the direction of sustainability, because I know you are in the Sustainable Development Commission. So any of your thoughts or advice for anyone listening about what we should be thinking of now in 2022
Okay, so
would
my
be awesome.
passion recently has become actually materials. So imagine we're on this little piece of rock that is called the planet
Right.
Earth. And we're like little ants. We've been sort of excavate materials, using them up at a faster
Hmm.
rate that we can recycle or reuse. So in 2017, we took out something like 100 billion tons of materials from the earth. So that included sand, gravel, clay, etc., which are essential building components. And of all the 100 billion that we took out, 60 billion was actually used for building related purposes. Now, these things are not renewable. So sand takes millions of years to form,
Well,
as does clay, gravel. So they're not renewable in that sense, whereas trees are. You can grow trees, etc. So my thing is, if you start with materials, thinking we're rapidly running out of, we're running out of rare metals, we're running out of sand even. What can we do as architects? People are sort of saying, oh, let's use electric cars, let's use solar panels, but all those need rare minerals and metals to actually manufacture those. So, and we're not very good at extracting them. So once these solar panels and Eiffels, etc., are thrown, we're not able to extract the rare metals from them, you know. So that's like really a very sad situation to be in, where we are just taking and taking and giving nothing back to the planet. So we need to think about what kind of buildings we are producing, what are they made of. And of course, you know, if you're making things out of trees, that's really great because, you know, trees also absorb carbon. And I mean, the more stuff you take out of the Earth's crust, the more carbon you
Mm,
generate in whatever way, you know, even through transport, the transportation of that material, through extraction, etc. So you're adding to the carbon burden that's already there on the planet. So architects and architecture students should be thinking about what materials they're using. And if they think about materials, then naturally you're going to reduce the carbon they.
nice. Why, well, thank you. That's really good to share. Now, I always find that podcasts, it can be one way, right? And because I'm technically the host and I'm asking you questions, but I'd love this to be a dialogue. And I asked a lot of questions at the start because I'm excited to have you here. But while you're here, I'd love for you, is there any questions or thoughts you have at the moment? I know I work a lot on architectural recruitment with students getting jobs and architects. Do you have a few questions to ask me, or one or two on the top of your
Yeah, no, that's
mind?
actually a great question because one book I wrote is called Autotelic Architect, and it's about how many different ways you can practice architecture. And so, actually, looking at you, you're running Architecture Social. To me, while you're not actually building buildings, you're actually practicing
Mm.
architecture. If that makes sense. Yeah. So I'd like to know from you, how did you is I yeah, how did
Oh,
you
yeah,
start it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, good question. Yeah, good question. And I'll be very truthful in the answer. So I worked in an architecture practice, EP Architects. They were very, very good to me. But I didn't have maybe the same passion that some of my other part twos had for certain aspects of architecture. I technical details, you know, I would be next to my colleague and they would love it and they would go into it and find out all that information. And my passion wasn't in that so much, but I loved architects. I loved people, and I didn't know what to do at first. So I kind of fell into recruitment because no one grows up and goes, mum and dad, I want to be a recruiter. No one does it. And it's a very unglamorous role. But a lot of what architecture is hard graft. There's a lot of hard stuff behind the buildings, right? And it's about relationships and it's about learning. And there were things in recruitment that with the architect side, the design eye, which I felt didn't quite work. Stuff like, for instance, the way recruitment's done is that big companies pay for individual roles. They might pay for a search for a BIM manager or something. And then you get a lovely architecture student that comes along. And due to the nature of recruitment, you couldn't really give enough time and love that you'd love to do to impart all this wisdom, because you might get sacked in this sales environment. So the architecture social, to me, now I run it, is kind of all the bits that I wanted to do. And when I was on furlough, I thought, right, I need to start building up this place where people can talk about whatever they want. And anyone knows, as you know, in architecture, probably that was too wide and I had to bring it down. I was like, right, what do I know, or what can I do during the pandemic? And that was really talking about helping people get jobs, not just architects even, but architecture students, but architects as well, or anyone that's been made redundant. And I kind of talking it through. And my goal then was to build this compository up that was a wealth of information that in the future, when I speak to a part two, I could say, here's a few tidbits, but have a look at all of this information to help them. And because sometimes in university, it felt like you could get some universities do a really good job at like helping students get into the industry, but others, so there's like, hey, well done, you've graduated, shake your hand, get the certificate. and you go out into the big world, and you don't know where to go. And there's a lot in between there, and it's very difficult finding a job for everyone, and it's a very stressful time. So that was my brief. So if I had a brief like an architect, it would be to make the job search less stressful, and that's really my approach. But I appreciate that, and I always say to people that it's the stuff I learned in part two when I design my website, or the way I work. You never lose that thing in you, and I agree, there's often different ways to do architecture. And the last bit I would add to that is sometimes I speak to people, and I encourage people to keep going in architecture, and you can do different routes, but you can add to the architecture scene in different ways, whereas architectural journalism, or design, or interior design, and then architecture, or there's just so much you can do. One of my part two colleagues, and one of my closest friends here in university, he doesn't do architecture anymore, but he learned architecture. He made all these models of monsters, and now he has like a YouTube channel with 1 million subscribers, but he actively designs the films and the monsters, and he's made a livelihood out of it, and he would have never done that if he didn't study architecture. So yeah, I think there's lots of ways you can do it, but you're right. I still and the other thing is, I still sometimes have to tell myself not to work the long hours. Like, we all have that thing in us. We have to be respectful of our time, and that's what my current bits of me that I'm learning at the moment, because I'm running my own business. And as you know, because you run your own businesses, trying to get that work-life balance can be difficult, but getting there slowly.
And the other thing is, what I tell people is that apart from different ways of doing architecture, if you actually diversify your income, then you're not dependent on one thing. So, when something didn't work out for me, because Brexit has been
Mm.
hard for me, COVID was hard for me. I thought, well, that's the end of my architectural design. But then I got so much work, lecturing online, uh, and other things, writing stuff. I did something like 21 or 24 podcasts or lectures in that first, 2020, that year. I was doing 2 every month, something like that. I never imagined that that would become a way of earning money. So I always tell people that, in hard times, just diversify your income so you're not depending on one thing. And this system of doing architecture in different ways, we need to be more respectful of it. Like, I've heard people say, oh, well, they're not doing real architecture, they're doing community engagement, or they're doing this and that and the other. I'm saying, hang on, they're still working in the built environment, right? They're still doing architecture. So we're not respectful of people who
Yeah.
practice different ways of architecture. We think there's just one way to do it. And that kind of respect has to come into the profession.
Well said. I think that's quite an important note, and I think that there are lots of ways to go about it, and as well, there's lots of ways. Some people I see in the industry can do add massive value, can be a director of a company, and still technically on paper be a part one. They can be qualified if that's their prerogative, or as you say, there's so much ways that we can add to the architecture scene, and getting involved, as you say, in as I think is the first step. And that's what I would encourage people to do, is because I was quite nervous at first about joining the RIBA council. I didn't know what to expect, or getting involved in certain groups, but you kind of have to go a bit out of your comfort zone, and you learn from it. And in my experience, joining stuff, I'm sure as well, when you founded Architects for Change, and you've been involved in the Equality Forum at first, it can be a little bit of a nervous thing, but then over time you meet people, you get involved, and you can make a difference. And that's what I try to encourage people, is that just getting out there. And the last bit I would add is like, even now we're recording a podcast. Before this, I never done a podcast. I never done live streams and all this stuff. And it's easy now when I've done 100 of them. But at first I was very, very nervous. And I remember the first podcast I ever did, it was, like you said, like us now, it was one-on-one conversations, and it was a little bit scary. Or even now, that because there's a slight delay, and that's fine, we'll edit it out. But, we're just having an honest conversation, not letting things get in the way. And then that's fine, isn't it? Things don't have to be perfect as well. And that's the last bit I would say on is that sometimes I remember some of my fellow students, perfection. And I'm like, it's always learning. We're always learning, and things don't have to be overly polished. I mean, you can just, if an honest conversation, I think above everything else is the best, or honest work, honest architecture, and so forth. Just doing what you can and putting yourself out there generally lends itself quite well. But I mean, do you have any final thoughts, Sumita, on that, or anything we talked about before we kind of wind up
Oh,
this
I mean,
lovely
I'm really
conversation?
impressed with what you're doing, your enthusiasm that you bring to architecture, through Architecture Social. And I've actually said this to people, that, there should be
Ah,
more young people doing what you're doing, because we need that. Sometimes people like us, we get old, we're not doing things the right way. We need a bit of fresh injection, tell us how to do things properly, or more, in the sort of wider context, or which is, uh, relevant to the time. What we did 30 years ago is probably not the way to do things. So I think younger people bring those fresh ideas to architecture. It's very important to listen to them. International students, the topic that we started with, they bring really great ideas. I've learned so much from actually talking to my international students. For example, I didn't know that uh, the word architect
mm,
is genderized in many languages. And I had asked them to explore this topic called a woman architect, whether that
mm,
should be a relevant thing or not, or whether they should be called architects, or whether female architects should be called women architects. And then I learned, to my surprise, that the Chinese have a different way of saying this, or, female architect, woman architect. The Italians have different words, architetta and architetto. They actually get their certificates into, differentiation of two sexes. Then I said, well, what about different genders? What happens if you're of a different gender? They have no answer. And so how people are practicing architecture, whether they're good things or bad things, I think international students bring us that awareness, because it's, we tend to think we live in the UK and we think, okay, that's our world, but there's so much else happening outside the UK, and we need to kind of think of architecture in a more sort of global sense. So it's great that, your podcasts are on YouTube and people can hear them and learn from them. So I think that's great. I say bring fresh ideas to architecture.
I absolutely agree with you. And I tell you what, it's all about being connected in that way. And so if anyone wants to get in touch, what is the best way that people can find you to
I'm on
start a
Twitter.
conversation?
I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn. You can find me in those three places. So do get in touch.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Samita. You've been an absolute star. One day you can tell me how to get that OBE. I'm not surprised you've got it with all the amazing trailblazing stuff you've done across equality, diversity, inclusivity, and sustainability, amongst other things that I'm sure along the journey. So thank you so much for being in the conversation. I'm going to end the interview in a second. Thank you so much for everyone that's tuned in, and get in touch with me. Take care, everyone. Bye bye now.